Today we have with us Melissa Wenzel. Super excited to introduce her. She is the Built Environment Sustainability Administrator at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So Melissa, if you want to kick it off and say hi and introduce yourself, we'd love to get started.
Sounds great. Well, hi, friends. I've worked at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for over 22 years, and I've been in this current role, Sustainable Built Environment, for 5.5 years. And I will say, and people who know me know this, that this has been my favorite job ever. So I get to work with so many different people from so many different types of industries, and I love being able to help people and make connections for people to resources to help them be successful. And to do so in a sustainable built environment way, there's a lot of people that are dedicated to these efforts here in Minnesota.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And we have with us today Carmen Prantel, our staff consultant. So I'd love to know how the two of you are connected. Carmen was so excited to get to introduce you today. So if you two want to chat about that a little bit, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so I went to the University of Minnesota, so was living there for a while, and I did a major called Sustainable Systems Management, and part of that degree path is you have to do a capstone, and you get to partner with a community organization. So Melissa was actually our community advisor on my capstone project and was a phenomenal resource, number one, in opening our eyes to kind of the sustainable built environment and different topics there. But then we got to dive into a really cool project that kind of explored the total cost and impact in the difference between deconstructing a building, demolishing a building, and repurposing or like renovating that building for new use. So kind of three main pathways.
Very cool. And obviously Melissa's influence has stuck with you over the years.
Absolutely.
So that would have been 2022. Is that the Ben
Correct.
building? Okay, great. This is my 4th year that I'm mentoring college students for their capstone course. So that was the first year I was doing it. So I was a little green myself in my role, but it's been a great opportunity. A lot of times people don't get exposed to the sustainable built environment world or just the built environment kind of as a systems perspective, which is an ideal career path that you went down, Carmen. Everyone that I talk to, it's like anyways, they really get excited because there are so many positive potentials out there and they get to learn kind of a new world. And then they realize the world around them is quite big in terms of buildings and building material management. I'm so glad that I did it that year. And that is foundational for me too. And this year's topic, where actually the students are focusing on what are the costs and the myriad of benefits of structural moving, of moving a house versus destroying it, landfilling it, and building a new house somewhere else. So
Wow.
I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, that's a huge undertaking, Melissa. Okay, so I feel like we have to go backwards just a little bit. And for those of us that might not know, could you actually tell us what does the term sustainable built environment mean in terms of definition? And then what does it mean to you?
Sounds great. So I'm not one to like rattle off Webster dictionary, whatever, but the built environment is everything that exists in buildings and structures. It includes parking lots and sidewalks and kind of the hardscapes. So around us, we're surrounded by nothing but built environment. And it can mean, brand new construction. So it can mean LEED certification or building green, things like that. We have a lot of practitioners in Minnesota that focus on green new construction. So it's been really, really easy to focus on the already built environment, trying to reuse entire buildings, building materials, working on unbuilding, focusing on efforts to unbuilt buildings, also called deconstruction. So to do so in a sustainable manner, we think about the traditional hierarchy of waste prevention and diversion over reuse, over recycling, over lower forces of management methods, ultimately to landfill. We don't really incinerate building materials all that often, so we don't really have to talk about that conversation, but how can we reuse what already exists? And if a building was built well, no matter what it looks like right now, you can change what it looks like. But if it was built well, you can adapt it and make it look whatever you want it to. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think something that like really intrigues me, and again, like I have that kind of systems approach, is that for you, there are so many different players involved and so many different points at which you can kind of come into the process and work with people to maybe push your agenda is too strong of a term, but, talk to people about exactly. Encourage people, talk to people about what this is. So I know a lot of people think of it typically on the design end with architects with whatever. But I think there's also, a point with contractors. How do you get them to change their mindset from, going in and demolishing to I'm open to deconstruction? There's also stuff with manufacturers. There's stuff with building owners. So what is kind of your approach like in dealing with so many different players and such a big process?
Well, I also went to the University of Minnesota, and back then I got a degree in environmental education. So really tried to be as generic as I could because I am a generalist, and that's really bode very well for me in my career to be able to know a lot of things about a lot of topics, and I might just not be able to go in depth. So this industry, as you just alluded to, is very rich in the points that intersect with organizations and individuals wanting to seek change. So we work with even the University of Minnesota Duluth for research, R&D, research and development related activities. And we have reuse retailers, we have material haulers, we have county, city, tribal government, we have manufacturers, we have remanufacturers, retail sales, deconstruction organizations, retail reuse sellers from either huge pieces of buildings to the things that exist inside buildings like furniture. So everything inside a building is also the built environment. And it really is an onion where it kind of goes on and on and on. We formed a stakeholder group when I first joined this program, and this is the first time we've had this program, where we had feedback from folks in kind of the construction demolition rulemaking concerned about what we might push. In this case, you were right, for an agenda. And they said, don't put all your eggs in the deconstruction workforce development basket, or don't require deconstruction if you don't have people who can deconstruct. And that was really an enlightening moment for me, because then I realized I really have to kind of work throughout the entire system simultaneously. So small efforts across the whole board to support the system as a whole. And your degree, the program that you went through, Sustainable Systems Management, is really key to what we're working on. I'm in a unit that's called the Sustainable Materials Management. But to change systems, it's needed to do that in terms of changing single materials from a better reuse potential. I really get to enjoy getting a call from somebody who's like, I have this extra wood, I don't know what to do with it. Are there grants available? To, hey, this beautiful old school is going to be demolished. How can we save it? To, again, what can we do with materials that have already been commingled and kind of crushed together? Is there any potential to sort it? It really does go on and on. And the more that people see that there is this rich foundation of people who care about this, and then so many different ways that these materials can be managed better, it's kind of infectious. It's kind of hard not to get enthusiastic about these developments. And I don't want to be like a Pollyanna and idealist and, do these things, but it's not affordable. I do try to meet people where they're at and try to understand what are their goals and what are the options that can help them achieve their goals in a more sustainable built environment way.
One of the things that stuck out to me that you just said was you were enlightened by people who said, don't try and push for policy that requires deconstruction when there aren't people who know how to deconstruct. What has kind of been your experience with training or anything like that for people who are maybe trying to shift but don't have the skill set or tools yet?
So the question is about how do we get these changes to happen, I think. And so the two responses I want to give to that, we heard during the stakeholder group and since then that we need to invest in these changes. And a lot of times without funding, we can still invest with encouragement and making connections, finding out solutions, working to empower others, local government, corporations, nonprofits, to be able to accomplish some of these goals. Well, 2023 was a great legislative session in terms of being able to ask for climate-friendly related activities. So 2022, before we knew what the legislative session or our record surplus would be, didn't even know it was going to be a record, we start drafting what we want to see legislatively driven in 2023. So I started that process in 2022 to request funding for a more sustainable built environment, had the funding and climate-friendly elected officials. And in 2023, a lot of grant funding went towards a lot of different programs. And this one, the built environment, received funding for the very first time and at a whopping $2 million. And usually some programs in the past would start with like tens of thousands or a little over 100,000. So this was a wonderful opportunity to really move the needle on this topic. So we did just announce earlier this week that formal news release went out on the 8 grantees receiving $2.4 million. So we were able to negotiate with other grant programs at the MPCA. Can we have a little extra, seeing that this is a one-time funding opportunity? So very pleased to see that we now actually have grantees working on local, regional, and actually nationwide deconstruction training with the nonprofit that I'm a board member of, Build Reuse. So local developments will spur actual national deconstruction training curriculum updates. So we actually have quite a few deconstruction organizations here in Minnesota. We have 5 Habitat for Humanity Restorers. We have Better Futures, Birch Group, and we are seeing more people kind of doing this as a side job. So there's one company in South Minneapolis called Lumber Stash, where the resident just kind of was poking around on his bike, looking at the roll-offs during remodeling season during the pandemic, and he noticed all this really high-quality old-growth wood. So he started working with those contractors and eventually had to go to something bigger than a bike and a trailer, but he actually quit his day job, which he didn't love anyways, so he was thrilled about this. He's now making 6-figure salaries simply by diverting. He does the actual physical removal, which he loves, that physical work. He removes this wood from fences, from flooring. He'll even go into school gymnasiums and remove that wood. And that kind of wood is really hot in the bar and restaurant market. So there's some wonderful and creative reuse potentials. But he's now starting this like mini franchise where he'll give people an email address, a stamp, not a business card. You can stamp the existing pieces of paper and a couple stickers, and others are doing the same thing really close to him. So he's building this ecosystem within Minneapolis, Minnesota, that I think is very able to be modeled anywhere USA, globally, things like that. Construction is happening.
It sounds like such a strong foundation in Minnesota specifically. I'm curious how you are working with manufacturers across the nation to make sure that materials can be sort of a part of this whole sustainable process in the built environment. So what's your perspective on that, and what are some of the things you're doing with manufacturers?
So me directly, I deal less with that, again, because I'm focusing on an already existing materials. And again, a lot of materials that are older, that have been in use for a long time, probably don't have some of the hazardous materials that we're seeing in new building construction materials. There is an organization that's called Habitable that focuses on clean construction materials, clean and healthy materials. And so periodically they'll pipe in and say, what are you working on, or can we find some solution for this? Or that material. So I stay in tune with what they're doing. But again, we have practitioners in Minnesota doing that, or nationwide. So if there's a place where someone else is filling that void, I don't need to necessarily be there. I support them if they need something or have some hurdles or want to get the word out about something else. That is a huge effort. And again, kind of stressing the already built environment tends to have higher quality materials. There's always still concern of like lead paint or painted wood in houses, or asbestos, mercury containing devices, things like that. But a lot of times the market will focus on highest, best use, high quality. Mercury switch in a thermostat probably don't get reused very much or at all. It's just focusing on what has a good high potential with these already clean existing materials. So it is a focus. U.S. Green Building Council will focus on it. We have a really strong representation in Minnesota. So again, I support them, but don't necessarily directly work with them.
Makes a lot of sense. And like I said, there's so many people to be working with that you do kind of have to spread out and, delegate and work with everybody.
And where the gaps are and work with those,
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that was interesting for me when I was doing my capstone project with you guys is when we first started, I was kind of like, total cost. Okay, how do we measure the social impact? How do we measure some of these things? Economic was easy. You can take the dollar value of, a piece of wood or something like that. But what do you guys use at MPCA as kind of success metrics maybe for getting really that total cost?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for context, with the comparing renovation versus destruction, the word I use instead of demolition, and deconstruction, reuse of materials, we challenge the students to really think about the holistic picture of the cost and benefits. So in terms of accessibility to high quality local materials at lower cost, remove non-existence of dust if you're not destroying a building, the benefit of workforce development. It takes more people to deconstruct, but we're empowering and paying people and not a machine. So some people say that there's up to 20 jobs for deconstruction and resale compared to one job in the demolition industry. So All those things matter. And until we start to talk about it, we don't think about it. And we just think in terms of cost and time. And those two are not the only factors. So just even simply talking about the number of people that are employed in the industry is one of the major markers we have. We just hired a first-time data person with life cycle analysis experience. And so I'm really eager to work with them to find out more about the life cycle impacts of these materials, especially when they're being reused. So those things are measurable. You worked with the WARM model. EPA has this modeling tool to help you understand if you were to reuse something or have a lower carbon impact material, here's the fewer carbon emissions that would have been generated, and kind of comparing it to like taking cars off the road or things like that. And so there's some really good tried and true metrics, and some of them are narrative. Some of them are just simply the lack of or reduction of dust from deconstruction or from demolition projects when one is deconstructing. And you can measure, the air quality or the air particulates and things like that. But sometimes having that story of you don't have to live next to a demo site, that evokes a certain feeling of materials are getting reused. People are doing this and people are getting paid, and the air is not being polluted. And those are pretty powerful stories, even if they're not necessarily in metric form.
And I know the building that we worked on in particular during my capstone was one that had historic significance to the University of Minnesota. And so there was nothing to use other than the narrative, but that those words in and of themselves were very strong.
I do have to talk about that building for just a second. So makes sense. So what was really cool about the 2022 University of Minnesota Sustainable Systems Management Capstone Project, working with me in the challenge, the problem that I gave the students, is taking this old building and assessing the reuse, demolition, deconstruction potential. So the building was originally built in 1907 as a cattle barn. 100 years later, it was renovated to be a student alumni center with classroom space and a small cafeteria. And so at the snapshot in time in 2022, when we were doing this work, we were saying, what would it take if we wanted to renovate it and keep it in existence for another 100 years? Which we think, the way that it was built, and it could very definitely last another 100 years. And so the building actually had a lot of exposed beams, and a lot of effort went into being able to see sort of the original footprint while no longer being a cattle barn. But they even had a small grain silo that they obviously, once they renovated, no longer had grain in it. It had the HVAC system in it. And so there's just, how can you take an existing building and be creative and be smart and save money? It takes longer. It might take more people and therefore a little bit more money, but it makes a big community difference when you can see this building and see a vision for reusing it, adaptive reuse of an existing building. So if somebody can reinvent a cattle barn for University of Minnesota potential, then there's a lot of possibilities out there.
Well, and I think it's so cool too that through these renovations, you have the opportunity to make the building in itself tell its story.
Exactly.
First, to be able to say this was a cattle barn and now here we are, this is what we're using it for today. Is there a space in the building that tells that story, or just kind of included throughout the design and renovations? You can see those original, some of the things you've mentioned.
Do you remember, Carmen, if there was signs?
I think they might have had like a plaque in the lobby or something that specifically spoke to the man that the cattle barn was named after. It was his originally at the University of Minnesota, obviously before it was transformed into the space that it is now. So I think they had a plaque kind of dedicating it to him, but I don't think they necessarily spoke to like the full depth of the background story.
Right. I'm trying to think. We probably did find information on the University of Minnesota or the Minnesota Historical Society for this building. And yeah, the actual veterinarian that the building was named after, there's a family history, including present tense veterinarians that are still in St. Paul, multi-generational, still helping out with animals, probably not cattle completely. There's a location downtown St. Paul that's the Palmori Animal Center. So I used to take my cat there. They're well known and well connected in Minnesota, but it's definitely a little bit more emphasis on the people connected to the building versus the building itself. But I do want to add that makes a really good point, or you bring up a really good point. We lose history when we lose buildings. And even if we're talking part of a strip mall or something, money went into the design, the purchase of the land, to construct the building, to operate and maintain it, to use it. And all of that gets wiped away when we destroy a building. And when we destroy buildings that have rich history, we can't get that back. We might be able to have a plaque in some cases, the building itself tells its story. So that's really good about this particular one that we're talking about. But there's so many buildings where we destroy history when the building goes away. And that was in favor post-World War II. And that's why old buildings were destroyed and newer, less efficient or lower quality buildings were built, because we wanted fresh, new, the latest look and all that. And of course, the styles change over time. But if you can have a great foundational building, you can change the look of a building, particularly the outside, pretty easily, much more efficiently and much more financially savvy than destroying a building and building a new one.
Do you have any other building success stories on transformations like that of existing buildings that you want to talk about? That one's hard to top, I'm sure, but...
Oh, no. I had a meeting with somebody earlier today, internal to the Pollution Control Agency, and adaptive reuse is sort of my favorite topic. And so they mentioned a school not far from where I lived, ironically in college, where it's been renovated to condos. And I have examples all across Minnesota for that, but I didn't know about this one, and it's in the Twin Cities, so I was curious. And it is a funky building that's built on a hill. So it's multiple levels. We're level zeros here. It's kind of like some of the buildings on the Staple campus at the U of M, or ground zero, ground one. It might be different levels depending on which side of the building you're walking into. And I would have struggled to think of it in a reuse potential, but somebody else did, and it's been a condo building for a while. So I added that to my list of already 75 examples that I have in Minnesota, because I've given presentations just on adaptive reuse. I do curate articles for newsletter for Minnesota Built Environment newsletter, and about every one article for deconstruction, novel reuse, policy decisions, I can get 2 articles that I find about adaptive reuse. I think globally and locally, we're starting to realize that the existing building stock makes sense to look at in terms of buildings. And for better or worse, the pandemic did cause us to have a huge surplus of vacant buildings. So now the potential is, what can we do with them? And across the United States and in Minnesota, we're seeing a lot of office to residential conversion happening, but just adaptive reuse in a very generic state. Lots of things being turned into something else.
Is that kind of how you got passionate about and how you got into your role? Was there a project or something in particular that sparked, I love material reuse?
Sure. That has been a foundation to my entire life, and not even just my career, but my life. Being in a family that focused on recycling when it became available back in the 80s and 90s in my community. Going to school, I don't think you knew that I was the president of the Environmental Studies Club, which I don't know if still exists on campus or not. And then having either volunteer work or my day job being connected to some way on reuse or reduction. So I started my career at the Pollution Control Agency within a technical call center for regulations. But the name was so generic, people called us up with questions about everything. So I literally got to learn about everything, including things at other agencies or even other states. So that general foundational knowledge led me to really realize that waste reduction, waste prevention really was interesting. And then I took a job within the industrial stormwater program where we regulate prevention of pollutants that come from industries, including salvage yards and bus garages and airports and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of the facilities that we were breaking late, a lot of them are recycling centers, transfer stations, manufacturers of remanufactured products, and then, of course, landfills too. And so this theme has always been a part of my career and a part of my life. And to be able to really do a deep dive in an area that we hadn't really done in Minnesota, and in fact, I don't believe that there's any other sustainable built environment administrator in the United States as a single role for their entire job. So I don't take that lightly, and I do find a lot of passion in it. And then I'm able to connect with people inside and outside of Minnesota to learn more and to share with what we're doing.
Melissa, if you had to give some words of encouragement to students that want to pursue a career in the sustainable built environment, what would you tell them?
I say go for it. I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to say, but I think that this is such a huge place to make a huge difference. We have spent a lot of time as a community, as a society, locally and globally, on reuse of a pop can or recycling of a bottle to turn that plastic into something else. Think about what the impact you're doing if you're also helping to do the same thing or better with buildings. If you're able to reuse an entire building, that's difficult. That's really, really difficult, but so rewarding. And more people who care about reusing our existing buildings, or at the very least, unbuilding buildings so that we can reuse the parts, it's huge. So EPA says that we generate twice as much construction and demolition debris as a nation as we do household trash. So imagine all the trash we generate as a country, double that. That's how much waste we send to our landfills and other sources. So we have a big problem and we need a lot of solutions, which luckily there are a lot out there. But this is making a huge difference.
Yeah, that's really amazing, Melissa. Thank you so much. And I don't know if you have anything else you want to share, but obviously we're here cheering you on. And just thank you so much for joining us today. This was really wonderful.
You're welcome. I will mention a couple things that the National Build Reuse Conference is going to be in Minnesota this year. It'll be in St. Paul, August 4th through 6th. And we have a student rate for, I think it's $25. And that's the same rate if you're in an AmeriCorps program or if you're an apprentice. So we really wanted to encourage local and nationally wide, for students and folks that are still in that learning mode to feel a part of the system. Build Reuse also did receive a grant to focus on this came from EPA and the funding, I believe, has been secured. Focus on low carbon construction materials. And so in the reuse world, what's lower carbon than reusing existing materials? So where the organization is hiring staff to help us create environmental product declarations, which is the equivalent of like a nutritional panel for, an item a food item, to be able to say, okay, this reused brick contains this less materials of, emissions or impact to the environment, things like that. So we're going to be working with organizations across the nation to create these product declarations for used building materials. So there's some really good national developments going on. And as somebody who is in Minnesota, focused on a sustainable built environment, naturally I'm able to do part of that for my day job.
I think that's super cool too. Like you are mentioning these nutritional labels, the visibility and the way that you can communicate that to people that maybe don't have experience or don't know the jargon is like huge, because when you sit down and you see the strict science of it, it might be right over your head. But like if you, like the warm model for me, when I was going through it was so helpful because it really took like the carbon emissions and I was like, I don't know what that unit means. And then they were like, this is the equivalent of driving your car for 2 years. And I was like, oh, that number is huge. Like maybe the value was super low, but the unit, held significance. And I couldn't understand that not having the background in it. And so to get that comparison to an everyday metric is like huge and very eye-opening, I think, for a large part of the population.
We're getting better at plain language, being able to tell stories in ways that others can relate and not have to have a translator or have somebody interpret this information. And that's the point with these environmental product declarations, is that people can start to look at materials that are like materials, brand new wood versus used lumber or recycled steel, whatever, and be able to say, so these materials have this sort of impact, but these reused materials have a much lower impact. And that people can make the choice based on the information they're given. So I really think this grant opportunity is going to be a game changer for the reuse building material industry.
Minnesota on the policy side is already relatively ahead of the game compared to maybe some other states. And there's a lot of policy coming out specifically in the built environment, stuff like B3. Because of that, does that feel supportive to you, or do you feel like you then have more challenges to push it even further? How are you doing that?
I don't know that I feel like there's more challenges. I feel like there's more opportunities to push things. I will say that, yes, Minnesota is very much ahead of the curve of a lot of states in this arena. That is foundational from past efforts of basic recycling efforts, waste reduction. So generations of people have been caring about these topics that allow us to now focus on the built environment, which is sometimes a big elephant in the room. It's just like too big to figure out. How do we deal with it? We still have all the, household recycling and waste reduction efforts that we need to take. So I really kind of feel like foundationally we're able to take what we've done in Minnesota and just take it to this next level, which now that I've been in it for 5.5 years, feels like something we should have been focusing on as a nation and even in Minnesota for a long time. But Minnesota, the Pollution Control Agency, created this position knowing that this is an important job. So I just think that things kind of springboard off of one another. And then others are like, well, Minnesota's doing this, or Minnesota has these efforts going on, and this city in Minnesota is doing it, and we're the same size city. Can we try? Like that sort of fear of missing out kind of gives that sort of desire to do what others are doing. And I'm happy to work with anybody outside of Minnesota to help them understand what we're doing so that they can do it too. The more of us doing it, the better off we all are.
Absolutely. Having been in it for 5.5 years, what would you say is kind of, if another city were to come to you and say, we see you doing it, we'd like to start, what would you say is like a step one?
Tell me more about your city, the people who are holding power. Do you have any sort of stakeholder group on sustainability? Do you have people that might be able to help further this goal? Do you have people who can, once you learn about this, you can make a pitch to your own city council or elected officials? What are the needs? Where are the people in power? And who are the people that can help influence the people in power to make these sort of changes?
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, that foundation and just knowing where to start is so important. And I think just even being able to ask the question and you guys setting that example in Minnesota is huge.
We've learned from other states. We've learned from so many other cities that are far beyond what we're doing in Minnesota. They're a city. It's easier sometimes. You got a smaller group of people that you're working with and you physically have a smaller boundary, but we're learning from really robust cities like Portland and the Bay Area and even in Boston and the Northeast United States that there's a lot of great initiatives where we don't have to reinvent the wheel because somebody's already doing it. And so a lot of it is that sort of copying the successes from others. It only makes sense. It's really efficient to take what already exists and to duplicate it for, your own unique city, state, county, tribal nation.
I think it's really interesting too, because the more you dig into it, the more you realize those, groups that do deconstruct or do focus on things like that exist in a lot of places that maybe you just don't know about if you haven't looked.
I was in Puerto Rico in 2022 and hurricane-battered buildings is a norm, but there's a lot of buildings that are built in a concrete shell. So I could tell that some of these buildings were not new construction, but everything but the concrete was removed so that they could rebuild with perhaps stronger building materials. And building with something that is going to withstand a hurricane means that they are more resilient. So I'm even seeing opportunities where that sort of reuse of the bones of the building, as we like to sometimes say, makes a lot of sense. So if you built the bones to last and then are able to perhaps upgrade with newer materials, better, stronger materials are available, which because of the climate disasters that are happening around the United States and our territories, there's more reimagining of different materials. And so more and more entities are starting to use more resilient materials as these hurricanes and storms and floods really start to increase. We're seeing that market change to reflect the climate that's changing as well. We can't deny that there are storms hitting parts of our country on a more frequent basis and hitting them harder. Those need to be considered for stronger resiliency. And so that's happening. So there's some positives in some of the sad developments that have been happening or the crises that are happening because of climate change.